Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the Wilson Center and the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, welcome to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding 2021 Virtual Annual Conference, focusing on the political economy of democracy and peacebuilding in Africa in the COVID-19 era. My name is Monde Muyangwa, and I am the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Africa program. Some of you were with us for an earlier session today, and so you're familiar with the SVNP. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me take a couple of minutes to quickly introduce you to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, also known as SVNP for short. The SVNP is a continent-wide network of 22 African policy, research, academic, and practitioner organizations that works with the Wilson Center's Africa program to bring African knowledge, analyses, and perspectives to inform U.S. and international peacebuilding and state-building policy on Africa. Generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York since its establishment in 2011, the project accomplishes this mission by generating African knowledge and analysis on peacebuilding and disseminating it within the U.S. and international policy ecosystem. The SVNP also runs a scholarship program through which we work to build the next generation of African peace builders. Through this scholarship, we facilitate research on peace building and state building by African scholars, train the scholars to translate the academic research into policy papers that are more easily digestible by policymakers, and we bring the African scholars together with US and international policymakers to discuss and share their analysis and options for advancing sustainable peace building in Africa. Finally, the SVNP works to understand, evaluate, and respond to both current and changing global environments in a way that informs how peace building is done in Africa. So once per year, we gather the heads of the SVNP for an annual conference to analyze and discuss these key issues, and we welcome you to this year's 2021 SVNP Annual Conference, and you will be hearing from several of the SVNP directors throughout the conference. So our first session earlier today looked at the challenges and opportunities related to democracy, development, and peace building in the COVID era. I thought it was a fantastic session, giving us a broad overview, that 30,000 feet looking down at how COVID has impacted democracy and development on the African continent. And we really got into some interesting discussions around elections, around social contracts, around the movement of democracy into the virtual space, term elongation, and the disconnect between peoples and their leaders. This session will build on that discussion by focusing on gender, youth, and technology and how they intersect with development and democracy in the COVID era. And we have three very good speakers who are going to talk to us about these issues, highlighting some of the key disruptions in these spaces and the key concerns, but also the opportunities for addressing some of these challenges. I will provide a quick introduction to all of our three speakers today. We have given them a few minutes, about 7 minutes, to offer their initial remarks. And after all of them have spoken, I will then open it up to a moderated question and answer period in which we invite your participation. As a reminder, you can tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close using the hashtags @Peacebuilding in Africa or @SVNP, and you can email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. John Temin. He is the director of the Africa program at Freedom House, overseeing the organization's efforts to advance democracy and human rights across the African continent. From 2014 to 2017, he was a member of the U.S. Department of State's policy planning staff, providing strategic guidance and long-term thinking to the Secretary of State. John has also served as director of the USIP's Africa program, leading the Institute's efforts to help end conflicts and prevent new violence. So we have asked John to speak to the question of how technology has changed or impacted democracy and peace building in Africa during the COVID era, and to highlight some of the key challenges and successes that we are seeing in this space, and to make 2 recommendations for addressing these technology-related challenges. John, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Monday. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be alongside this really esteemed group. And I know the SVNP has accomplished a lot over its long tenure. I'll start really big picture, but very quickly get into the issues. My organization, Freedom House, does this annual report called Freedom in the World, which documents democratic progress or lack thereof all around the world. And what it says is that we're in a pretty difficult place right now. This is the 15th consecutive year of global democratic decline. That's globally, but when we hone in on Africa, it's also a pretty difficult picture. Last year, 21 countries in sub-Saharan Africa went down in our ratings, and only 7 of them went up, unfortunately. Our ratings do this thing where we put countries into 3 categories: free, partly free, and not free. When you look at the population of sub-Saharan Africa, right now, only 9% of people live in countries that we categorize as free. 49% live in countries we call partly free, and 42% live in not free countries. So it's a difficult picture in terms of democracy, but that's true globally, not just in Africa. So talking about how technology relates to democracy, if you were to rewind 10 years ago, we might be having a conversation about how technology is a great liberator and is a great tool against autocracy. And that's still true to an extent today. But unfortunately, when we fast forward back to today, we see that autocrats have really learned to harness technology tools for their advantage as well, to use technology to continue closing political and civic space. There's 3 tools that I would highlight that we see autocrats using consistently, globally and also in Africa. One is internet shutdowns, or sometimes internet throttling, which is just slowing down the speed of the internet. In 2019, an organization called Access Now counted 25 different internet shutdowns in Africa. More recently, we saw shutdowns around the elections in Uganda and in Tanzania last year, a major shutdown in Ethiopia last year, also shutdowns in Zimbabwe, Togo, Burundi, Chad, Mali, and Guinea, all in the year 2020. Another tool is digital surveillance, and a lot of African countries are starting to use digital surveillance tools, which poses major concerns for privacy. At least 15 countries have AI-enabled surveillance technology. A lot of that technology comes from China, some of it from Israel, some of it from Western countries as well. Again, to use an example from Uganda, they recently purchased an $126 million CCTV package, which of course allows for surveillance. And some of this is in the interest of security, but of course there's a fine line between security and intrusion. And there's all sorts of opportunities that these systems provide to spy on political opponents and activists and to use them for various nefarious means. There's also a lot of concern about smart city initiatives that are happening all around the world and in Africa and the potential problems there. Third tool is disinformation. And again, of course, a global problem, including in the United States, but we're seeing this in Africa. One example I would cite specifically is in the recent war in Tigray in Ethiopia, where we've seen all parties involved in that war try to use all sorts of disinformation to muddy the waters and advance their messages, and some very active and very ugly online discourse and misinformation going on concerning the tragedies in Tigray and all of the carnage that has happened there. Now, it's not all grim, because going back to what I said earlier, there really are some very positive uses of technology going on as well. And I would cite in particular the really impressive protests that have been happening around the continent. There's been a real uptick in protests and successful protests in recent years. Look in particular at the revolution in Sudan a couple years ago. A lot of that was based on technology, a lot of very savvy, relatively young planners and drivers of that revolution and the protests who relied on technology tools and who were able to evade government technology repression. Even more recently, look at protests in Eswatini, which are really unprecedented, the scale that they recently happened. Some of that was driven by online organizing and using online tools. And I would look as well at one of the real successes of last year, which was Malawi. and the way there was a substantial protest in response to really flawed elections that led to renewed elections and a change in government. Again, a lot of online organizing going on there, a lot of technology tools being used behind the scenes. I'd also point to the way technology tools are being used to counter corruption and expose corruption on the continent. And corruption, of course, is widespread and a huge source of public discontent. In particular, in Zimbabwe, there's been some really interesting stuff coming out recently about kleptocracy and how deeply ingrained it is within ZANU-PF and across the state. And a lot of technology is being used to expose that and to broaden the understanding of how that kleptocracy works. Technology has also been used in a number of instances in terms of service delivery in really productive ways. And it can also be used with elections, and in particular, monitoring elections and running elections. But of course, there's a bit of a two-edged sword to that because technology can be nefarious in election processes as well. Let me just start to wind up with a few recommendations in terms of how to use technology for good on the continent and what civil society in particular can be doing to push these tools towards the forces of good. One is we've seen some really interesting cases of strategic litigation being used to push back against authoritarian uses of technology. This is where lawyers, civil society file cases, in particularly targeted at certain laws or regulations that are especially destructive. And so we've seen some effective uses of strategic litigation in Sudan, Togo, and Zimbabwe that have all reversed network shutdowns and censorship decisions in those countries. So that's worked in some cases. It's really important to build digital literacy among the population so people understand what they're seeing online, so they know how to spot misinformation, so they know how to spot things like deepfakes. And civil society, I think, has a really important role to play there in terms of that broad public education on how to be smart online, how to effectively judge what you're looking at and try to make a decision for yourself as to whether it's accurate or inaccurate. And then more broadly, I think it's really important that African voices be part of the global conversation that's happening right now in terms of regulating technology. That conversation is being driven largely by the global north, but there's all sorts of conversations going on about appropriate regulations for technology. What's the role of social media companies in terms of keeping things on their platforms and off their platforms? What's the role for physical technology tools such as CCTV? What kind of restrictions should be placed on how those things are exported around the world? I think we need to see a lot more African voices in that global conversation, engaging with governments, engaging with technology companies, because they could really move the needle in that kind of conversation if that engagement is effective. Let me just say one final thing, because I was asked to speak a little bit about COVID-19 and how it factors into all this. You know, what COVID is doing is it's providing some cover for authoritarian leaning governments to be even more authoritarian under the guise of a public health response. And it's hard to draw the line between a genuine public health response, and some restrictions really are called for, and what is veering into the realm of political and crackdowns that are meant more to advance a political agenda. But I think we're definitely seeing some of the latter across Africa. And the question really is, whenever the pandemic recedes, and that is some ways away, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, are those new restrictions going to stay in place? Or will we see them pulled back as well? Because we don't want those things to become permanent, as is too often the case. So I'll stop there. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, John. That was just really, really key and important points that you raised. I appreciate how you concluded that discussion, because my fear, to your last point, is that the longer the COVID goes on, these trends are going to be normalized. in terms of they just become the way democracy or undemocratic processes are built into the fabric of African societies. And so what do we do about that? So I thought that was a really, really powerful way to end your presentation. How do we stop their normalization? And that has got to be part of the discussion that we have here today. So thank you. Fantastic start to this session. Let me turn to our second speaker, Ms. Helen Kezi-Noor. She is the Executive Director of the Women's International Peace Center, member organization of the SVNP. She has an academic background in gender and international development and over 16 years of experience on working on women's rights, gender, peace building, and conflict resolution and governance. She has led regional and international training and research programs and advocacy on peace and security in Africa, including in Liberia, South Sudan, Uganda, the DRC, Sierra Leone, and Burundi, as well as Asia. She has also provided technical support for peace mediation engagements by women's activists in Burundi and the DRC. We have asked Ms. Helen to look at the recent trends and issues related to gender, democracy, and peace building, how COVID-19 is impacting women's participation in both, and to share some innovations and best practices for the way forward. So Helen, over to you.
So good afternoon. Thank you so much, Monday. And thank you, John, for starting us very well. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, colleagues who have joined us in this public event. It's always exciting to be in this space where we are discussing and teasing out, challenging ourselves in terms of peace building in Africa. And it's so interesting that this time around we're looking at democracy. And of course, John has given us very good start. Just to start by saying, in terms of the recent trends, that before the pandemic, a number of African countries and heads of states have moved to undermine term limits. Some have changed constitutions, others have rigged elections, all towards remaining in power. So elections have usually been characterized with violence and discrimination and marginalization of women. And I'm sure we have a lot of evidence and research for this. But also we've seen a lot of use of state military machinery to attack opposition and dissenting voices, particularly civil society organizations. So the pandemic has only exacerbated a decline of democracy across the sub-region in that COVID has given authoritarian leaders greater leverage and provided further pretext for postponing elections. We have seen that in Ethiopia and Somalia, Muslim opposition figures in Uganda and Tanzania, and imposing restrictions on media across the continent. The enforcement of pandemic restrictions by security services has often been brutal in what we have seen in Uganda, provoking instances of instability, such as violent demonstrations we saw in Kenya, and even in South Africa, more advanced democracies as we tend to think. Actually, in the late 2020, and this is in line with what John has just said, it was reported that democracy in 80 countries was worse off due to the pandemic. So where elections were organized and leaders faced mass protests in Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, they took advantage of the spread of coronavirus to manipulate social distancing requirements, constraining the activities of opposition political parties and civil society organizations. In Uganda, the 2021 elections were characterized by unprecedented violence, where some of the opposition leaders were arrested multiple times. And we have the leading opposition leader, the young man, and I'm sure Max will talk more about him, who was arrested so many times. And this has actually also impacted on women's participation, because when you have a high level of violence, women are not going to put up their head there to be killed or to be raped, to be sexually harassed in the name of violence around elections. So this pattern of repression we're seeing is going to continuously affect the level of women's participation. But we're going to see that, we've just said COVID might not be going soon. So it's going to intensify. And I think that, from civil society perspective, and we discussed this before, we're going to see new innovations in terms of resilience also that will emerge in the African continent. The emergence of digital age has also continued to influence election processes. The internet and media has empowered African youth, Bobi Wine has used social media to catalyze his people power movement. But how about women? We've not seen women take opportunity of this digital advantage, to be able to also push forward the agenda. We had a number of women use it, but not to the extent that we saw Bobi Wine use it to mobilize his people's power movement. But this is the reason it's not very far. Women do not have as much access to technology as men do, and they do not have money actually to pay for such technologies. In terms of numbers, women's representation in democratic processes has been on the rise, I can say, but it's so gradual. Despite the fact that we have policies and platforms to advance women's inclusion in democratic processes and peace-building processes, the numbers and the levels of women's involvement in these processes remain worryingly negligible. I think it's only in Rwanda where we have above 60% of women in parliament. In Uganda, we are still struggling 30, 32, 33%. So most significantly, we've not seen a lot of women in decision-making positions or in peace-building processes. Women constitute only 24% of over 12,000 parliamentarians in Africa. So we are not doing anything in that regard. There are only a handful of women in executive positions. We just got by accident, somehow in Tanzania, it's by accident, we got a female president. In Uganda, we just had an appointment of a female vice president and a female prime minister. And we're just watching the space to see how the state is going to be controlling these stages of notion of putting women there because you could control them is also is one of the characteristics of women's participation in decision making in Africa. So in terms of innovations and good practices that have emerged, I want to give an example of what the Women's International Peace Center did in the 2020 elections in conjunction with the Uganda Women's Network and other organizations. We implemented the Women's Situation Room for the elections. The Women's Situation Room mobilizes women and youth to promote peace before, during, and after elections. We understand that we had an assessment and we observed that the political environment in the build-up to the elections in Uganda was charged. We had reports of harassment, intimidation, acts of corruption, human rights abuses, were perpetrated by all political opponents. It's not just one person. Different forms of violence were witnessed, physical, psychological, that actually left deep scars among electoral candidates, campaign teams, and communities. What we focus on as the Women's Situation Room is to attempt to eliminate obstacles to women's participation in electoral processes by particularly the issue of violence against women, which we've seen to be one of the reasons why women do not participate in this aspect. So we use multi-track approach, one that works across different levels of society to link high-level actors and non-governmental representatives for civil society and grassroots and local communities in order to promote peaceful elections. Some of the approaches were possible for us at that time because the COVID pandemic in Uganda had not spread to where it is today. So there were opportunities to have dialogue, to have workshops, to have trainings, but also we hadn't had that kind of lockdown, that we've seen today. So we worked in about 30 districts. What we did was to establish women and peace, youth peace networks. We trained about 1,000 women, 1,500 women, 1,500 youths in this district for them to, we trained them in conflict resolution and peace building for them to constructively promote peace building at the local communities. And we were doing this because we were very positive that on a face-to-face interaction was more productive, than, of course, we used other means, we used media, we had campaigns on radio and TV, but knowing that most of the population would not have access to this technology to be able to see the messages. So we also worked with youth because we believed in peer-to-peer peace building, where youths try to convince themselves, that it doesn't worth it for you to be used by politicians to cause election violence, as the case has always been in Uganda. So we partnered with media houses. We also had toll-free lines, and we developed a mobile app. So in terms of technology, we try to use these technologies, but also having in mind that anything could happen. And John already said it, the internet shut down. So even if we had the Amani app, which was Amani is peace in Swahili, where people could report incidences of violence for us to intervene. Of course, when there was internet shutdown, it didn't work. So we had to then back up with our toll-free lines, for people to call us and report those incidences. So we have eminent women who we have in the room, train them in mediation. And because we had established relationship with the police, the army, and several election stakeholders, including the political parties, the eminent women are able to call on them when their incidences are related to election violence. And during this period, we received about 1,900 calls in our call centers, which were located in 4 regions. So also trying to reach out to different regions, getting closer to communities for them to report using different medium, telephone, and where the internet was not working, people were out in the field monitoring the elections. This actually helped us, to create awareness, to build peace, but using these women and youth that we have trained to try to catalyze and build peace at the grassroots level. Did we achieve anything? Yes, we did. At least we were able to build local infrastructures for peace, which actually enhanced, peace building during the elections. And also the training enabled women and youth to engage more effectively to influence formal and informal peace building processes around the elections. And we did this within the infrastructure for peace in Uganda, where you have peace committees at the district level that you could engage with, to be able to call their attention when incidences, but also calling on political parties to talk to their agents, and even candidates for them to stop any acts of that. So I think that at the end, we were able to use intervention decks of army, police, the Electoral Commission to report some of these incidences that we had in the room, and they were able to intervene very quickly. So we believe that, the Women's Situation Room contributed in a way to stopping and reducing the election violence. And we continue to have dialogue with different stakeholders because, of course, while we know we monitor the elections, there were places where people were not satisfied with the result. The level of transparency in the elections could actually be questioned because of the internet shutdown, because of some of the restrictions and force that was used against political opposition and civil society. So this example has shown that, we could actually explore different entry points, in terms of influencing, the election agenda and also the peace building agenda, particularly for marginalized groups like people living with disabilities, women, young people, for them to be able to, influence and have a chance to participate in promoting sustainable peace. But I also think that bringing youths and women on the table is also something, we've been able to do, having women to intervene. We had a youth desk where we also brought young women and men to track and give us intelligence about what youths were organizing, around the elections. And we try to distill, those processes. I think I have 1 minute more, Monday. So I would just like to say that, what are some of the challenges? We've talked about shrinking civic space, but speaking from a civil society angle, it would be important for me to share that government is also changing the ways they are using counter-terrorism laws and policies to try to clamp down on civil society organizations. In Uganda, before the elections, a number of civil society organizations, including ours, had their accounts frozen in the name of, financial intelligence agency monitoring the activities of civil society organizations. And many of them could not do anything around the elections because their accounts were frozen all the time until after the elections. So we've also seen that kind of creativity and innovation on the part of government in how they are dealing with shrinking civic space. When they shut down the internet, they also try to shut down the resources in order to clamp down on what civil society could do to monitor. And a lot of civil society organizations were not accredited to monitor the elections. So their voices and their perspectives in the elections were then limited in terms of, how credible the elections were. I will stop there, Emma. Thank you so much.
All right, my sister, I know you're passionate about these issues. We could see it, feel you, we hear you. It came through loudly and clearly, and I thought some really, really good and powerful messages. I loved you talking about the innovation around the Women's Situation Room and the youth desks as well. I think bringing together two constituencies that have really been impacted or typically impacted on this democracy question. And I thought setting the table very nicely for our next speaker, whom I'm delighted to introduce now. And our next speaker in this session is Mr. Max Amanu. He is the Programs Officer of Northwind Foundation, an affiliate organization of Changing Lives Switzerland, which is an NGO that focuses on youth empowerment and livelihood through skills development. He is also the research team lead for the East and Southern Africa region in the UNESCO Youth as Researchers COVID-19 Pandemic Response Project. He is currently an active member of the Commonwealth Youth Peace Ambassadors Network. So Max, we asked you to look at that youth dimension, how COVID has impacted youth in an African context around questions of democracy and peace building. So over to you, Max. So Max has a screen to share with us. Just get started whenever you're ready.
Okay. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Monde, and the other speakers for leveling the ground for me to make it easier for me to talk about this insightful and yet interesting, conversation. So I'll just go straight to my talking points. So going to talk about some of the ways in which COVID-19 has impacted the role of youth in participating in civil society. And of course, in democracy in particular, it's important to note that youth are not homogeneous. They are youth which are female, youth which have disabilities, youth that live in rural areas, others in urban centers, and of course, also they are youth which are actually refugees for that matter. So when we are talking about this, we are trying to look at all the possibilities of all these different forms of youth to get involved in democratic processes, and which is one of their rights actually. So one of the ways in which youth have been disrupted in participating in democracy in the recent setting, which is the COVID-19 era. Some of African countries, including Uganda, went into elections, and their way campaigns went scientific, including elections were around a time when movement was restricted in a way. There was no, free movement. Of course, there was fear, among the young people that if you move, you could easily, contract the disease. And then, of course, also the fact that there were measures put in place to combat the spread of the virus, where the transport fares were doubled and some places tripled actually, which hindered most of the youth from moving from the places where they were to be able to cast their votes. And those who try to participate in election processes, for example, to contest for positions, it was very difficult for them to get space to campaign since they were not allowed to move because of the restrictions put in place to curb the spread of the virus. So most of the spaces were taken by the prominent, people who already have a level ground money to spend to be aired on national television, for example, or a national radio station, for them to be able to campaign, to give their message to the public in order for them to be voted into an elected position. So some of these things are hindered, youth from either getting involved into democratic process of getting elected, casting their votes. And then, of course, some of the issues surround their actual involvement in civil society, which involves like working for them to be able to be active in the space. Most of the civil society organizations downsized in that period because of lack of funds to be able to facilitate a bigger team. So they decided to work with a smaller team and still achieve their desired objective. And as we may be aware that the youth are the most affected in this situation, reason being they are the ones with the least skill set because of their age. Some of them are just trying to penetrate into the space. It's maybe their first job or second job for that matter. So when they are normally trying to downsize, they get people with the highest skill set to stay. And of course, that skills come with age, experience, and of course, their education level. So these are some of the things that hindered them from participating in civil society. And then because of the whole COVID-19 situation, disease or virus, most of the youth were affected in terms of anxiety, being unsure whether you contract the virus, or if you contract it, would you get well? And then would you get the vaccine? And then would, all that, of course, since some of them lost the income sources and some of them lost their loved ones, unfortunately, in the struggle, that all, didn't allow them to get involved fully into the democratic processes. That includes the campaigning and voting and all other factors surrounding democracy. So that being said, there are also challenges facing youth in civil society in the COVID-19 era, which is like they have, like I already hinted on this one, they have limited skill set and experience. So that makes it harder for civil society organizations to hire them, since they normally have a limited budget, which is directed from the funding agency, which states maybe you must have this particular number of workers to take on this particular project. So much as they would love to hire, they would of course need to achieve the desired objective of the funds at the expense of the young people, since they most of the times do not have that much, digital experience. Of course, most of the work went online, if not all, because of the pandemic. So this means that there was need to have reliable, affordable, and stable internet. So some youth which are located in the rural setting could not have this chance. That would mean they would not definitely get involved in civil society participation, simply because internet distribution in terms of pricing and stability itself is questionable. So it's only in the urban setting you try find some stability, and where you find some youth who are able to afford. But as you get out of the city centers of the African countries, including Uganda, it becomes harder for you to actually even stream live on a call like this. It will become very difficult. So that would mean you are not able to work. And of course, that would mean you are not able to get involved in this civil space. So because also of the remote and virtual work, most of the youth, of course, got into trying to get a job online, trying to maybe do things online. But because also other people are taking advantage of this situation to scam and defraud, this youth, it is one of the challenges they are facing. So their ability to not detect which one's a scam, of course, and when they get scammed, they get limited, in getting involved in this space. Let me quickly go into the opportunities that exist to increase the participation of youth in democratic governance and peace building. One of the most prominent one is that most of the organizations and most of the governments who are involved in peace building and organizations have designed, courses which are free, accessible for youth, for them to be able to attain a skill. In case they are, of course, have a limited experience in the peace building space, this is an opportunity for them to learn. Most of these courses are actually free, and then some of them have just a small price tag. And then because there is also opportunity to work remotely from home. So youth could tap into this opportunity to gain another skill, since most of the time you can actually work part-time. It's only some time when you need to work full-time. So they can take advantage of this, be able to gain an extra skill in the peace building process. And then there is also new and emerging technology, which is in space for them to participate in democratic governance. One of these is like use of social media tools to be able to spread that message. And of course, artificial intelligence here helps in a way that once there is an incident or there is a message that needs to cut across to the youth who are involved in peace building processes, the AI tries to communicate to anyone who cares or who has a trend and interest in the peace building process. So it becomes easier for them to see the message, and it becomes easier for them to actually hold, some of these perpetrators of at book, so that they create space for them to get involved in peace building. There are also virtual fellowships in place, and this also is something for youth to use in order to upskill, and most importantly, to get more connected, to be able to learn from each other. There is also now more opportunity that even when you're from Uganda here, I can be able to connect with anyone from any part of the world. So, and finally, I can give some recommendations that international actors, local actors can use to increase youth participation in democratic governance and peace building processes. International actors should map grassroots organizations and network them to contact and get contact database, which can help them mobilize the youth. So because of the current pandemic still, I can say, youth are scattered all over the place. Even those who were probably in the cities have moved to villages for survival. So organizations which do not have a grassroots setting becomes hard for them to serve and tap into the youth space. And of course, youth also have stood up, some of them, to get involved in policy processes. So it's important for policy for African countries to tap into the skill set of the youth, to have their voices heard in all the processes, being involved in coming up with the recovery policies of COVID-19, and to put back the continent at shape. And then private sector, public sector, which is government, and then social sector players like the civil society also should invest in ICT infrastructure, because this is where the post-pandemic era is going to, leave us at. This is going to enable them to be able to easily, have the youth involved at any processes, just in case there is any other pandemic or endemic in the future. And this will be able to help us to continue providing the services, continue having them involved in these processes, and of course, keep in touch with them. And then finally, African countries should come up with data protection and policy regulations to protect privacy of individuals. Because of being online, we need somebody somewhere to be able to protect the youth who are the majority, who are online, who do not have the opportunity to get involved in this, some of these processes, to protect their data, so that whoever maybe is collecting their data should be able to be regulated that if you don't need this, maybe you don't need to collect it. And then if you need this, maybe you should be able to use it well and dispose it when you don't need to. So I end here, and then I look forward to engaging further.
All right. Thank you so much. Could you take down your screen share, and then we will go. Fantastic. So thank you to our three speakers, and Max, I'm glad you reinforced the point that John made towards the end of his own presentation about the importance of Africa being a part of the global conversation on how we regulate technology. And so that's a powerful point that I hope we will pick on. What I'm going to do is I'll ask, Helen has a 2-minute sort of intervention to make on the issue of youth, and then I will ask for 3 very quick interventions from some of our SVNP members, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. So Helen, back to you for your 2 quick 2-minute intervention on the question of youth.
Okay, so maybe it's even less than 2 minutes. I just wanted to share that in the peace building and democratic environment, there's this stereotype around the fact that youths are the ones who are, who are the ones who are violent. They are being used by politicians. But what we found is that actually youths have the capacity, because they don't want, they're only demanding, for good governance, for them to be recognized and acknowledged, for them to be part of decision making. So they're kind of stereotype. We need to question and challenge that notion that youths are not generally, violent. They are also peaceful, when they are used. But something else that we have also observed, in monitoring the elections is that a lot of youth were not able to vote because at the time of voter registration, they were 16, and then now the elections have come when they're already 18, and there was no plan, to be able to vote. So the agitation for them to be part of the electoral process was real and genuine, but nobody was listening to them. So we also need to see how election monitoring bodies factor in some of these issues that, affect youth and their participation in elections and in peace building. I thought I should add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen. Those are really, really good points. And it's interesting because I hadn't even thought about the aspect of delayed elections and how they can end up disenfranchising a portion of your population. And so I do think that that is a good point for you to raise, but also the one about challenging the stereotype of who African youth are and what drives them. I think our speakers did a fantastic job of really giving us a more in-depth feel into the 3 issues of technology, youth, women, and the intersection with democracy and development in this COVID era. What I want to do now is just turn the mic over for 2 quick 2-minute interventions to Dr. Tall, who is a research director at the Institute for Policy Analysis and at IPA, Senegal, to give our intervention on agriculture development in the COVID era. So IPA works on agriculture. We know that there's a very real danger that food security is going to be impacted under COVID. So Dr. Tall, let me just turn it over for you just for 2 minutes on what this looks like from that agricultural perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share some insight on agriculture and COVID-19 with this savvy audience. More than the disease itself, more than COVID-19 itself, it's the measure taken to fight the expansion of this pandemic that had exacerbated the fragility of the Senegalese agricultural system. Restriction on the movements of people, the closure of weekly markets, the closing of borders have led to a decrease in sales for many commodities, but also an increase of price for these commodities. In Senegal, most of the support measures from the governments have been targeting the formal sector. And as you may know, the majority of the population, mostly women and youth, are involved in the informal and the self-employment sector. So in our work, we tried to document this phenomenon, and we did it through studies on the impact of COVID on key value chain, using synthesis of debates from the rural world, and for that we changed our habits, and we used other technology. We used WhatsApp, Zoom when it was possible to talk with the people in the rural area. And these exchanges through several webinars made it possible to make a precise point to the authorities, because at the beginning of the pandemic, everything was said and nothing was really clear. And following these different events, the government took steps to open rural market with some restrictions, but open them, allowing rural people who were in town during the dry season to return to their villages, to prepare work in the agricultural field, and this is thanks to the work that IPAR was doing. Now this documentation, this work is used to inform recovery program in different value chains in Senegal. So these measures, as you have already said, have pushed the weakening of already vulnerable population and community and fueled very difficult situation. We are now exactly a year after the first restriction measures. And a few months ago, Senegalese youth were in the street for what was seen as political riots. Rapidly, these political riots turned into hunger riots with looting of supermarkets for a few days, which is quite unusual for us in Senegal. This situation was partly deactivated by the ending of the restriction measure like curfew and closing of the public places. So there's a real link between security and this pandemic situation. So in the start of the third wave of the COVID-19, the implementation of restriction measures are discussed within political and medical stakeholders. However, everybody is fearing new incidents with angry youth still delaying these measures. So
thank you. I'm going to ask you to conclude so I can get to the other 2 minutes so we can get the discussion going. Thank you.
Thank you. So this crisis was a surprise for all of us. But one of the recommendations that came up really strong within the civil society in West Africa and in Senegal is the employment of youth, and in their employment, particularly in the agricultural sector. So I would finish up with that, and thank you for your attention. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tal. Let me ask Dr. Ogenga, who is also an associate professor of communications and media studies and the founding director of the Center for Media, Democracy and Peace and Security at Rongo University in Kenya, a member of the SVNP. Dr. Fred, can you just give 2 minutes, please? Just 2 minutes on technology so we can get to the questions.
Monde, that's very unfair. I wanted to say so many things and I've started speaking so very fast. I wanted to point out to the idea of the social contract and the problematic with the state. And if you agree that currently democracy is the best way to envisage our social contract today, then we find elections as the best way to express that. Then we find problems arising, and 3 key issues arising there are questions of representation, questions of accountability, participation, and issues of development. This is where technology comes in. So technology has been playing a double-edged sword, more so to the negative side, with devastating consequences found in the winner takes it all phenomenon in Africa, where we've seen people inciting each other, and technology has played into the historical fault lines, like ethnicity. So we advocate for the idea of consociational democracy, where we have institutional designs that are uniquely African, based on the local ecology, listens to local voices, that these are the things that should be embedded in African institutions and celebrated as social contract going forward. And technology can play an interesting role in that. So 3 key things about technology is that technology has got technical specifications that makes it worse for democracy, which is attention economy, surveillance economy, and the question of algorithms, which play negatively when it comes to issues of expression online. So conclusively, what we need is social media literacy programs. These are literacy programs that are there to train ordinary civic society members and citizens or cyber citizens on the best ways to positively exploit technology for the sake of democracy. So all those involved in that enterprise should collaborate in that direction. Monde, you're muted.
I said, I think you just reinforced the point that our brother made about Max, about social media literacy programs and so digital education. So that's a powerful point. Dr. Oduro, another member of the SVNP, your 2 minutes, and please keep it to 2 minutes. I want to get back to our primary slate of speakers, please. Sorry, it's Dr. Ozo, I'm sorry.
Oh,
All right, I don't see Dr. Ozo. So here's what
I'm here. I'm here.
All right, 2 minutes.
My video was not allowing me to join, but my 2 minutes on this, I think most of the points have been made, so I wouldn't want to overstress this. Professor Ogenga had mentioned that technology is a double-edged sword, and that is what it is, with respect to ability to use it in good terms and also for bad. But my emphasis going forward are on 2 things. For technology to work well, we need strong policies and regulations, because if we have strong implementable policies, we'll be able to regulate the excesses of the bad side of use of technology. Because those that use technology for bad things, like for radicalization, for social media revolution and upheavals and cybercrime, it is only through policy and regulations that you can regulate and bring to book those who are exceeding their bounds. Of course, we don't want to overemphasize the importance of these technologies, but Africa also need to be careful about what we call technology lock-in. Technology lock-in is where we cannot, on our own, develop some of these technologies, but depend totally on exogenous capacity and technology for our survival. And that affected us really during this COVID. You find out that no African country has been able to come up with remediation, with a vaccine, because we depend on the outside ones. And that's why it is bad to lock ourselves in technologically when development is concerned or involved. Finally, there is need to for African governments to up their game in investments in technological development. Because as we speak, since 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, African heads of state agreed to invest 1% of their GDP to research and development, which translates into these technologies and innovations. But over 40 years now, there is no African country that has been able to invest this 1% of their GDP towards R&D. And this has affected us in terms of technological development. So I'll end it here. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So some really, really good interventions. Our 3 main speakers got us off to a great start. I will now open it up for questions. And just as a reminder to the online audience that you can tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close using the hashtags @Peacebuilding in Africa or @SVNP, or email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. And with that, let me take the first question that we have received. I believe this comes to you, Helen. And the question is, with the increasingly disenfranchisement of women in politics, mainstream economics, security, decision-making, why haven't women mobilized regionally and throughout Africa in a true radical movement? And what would it take to create such an African women's movement? So let me turn that over to you, Helen, and then we will take another question and pose it to the other speakers. So Helen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very interesting because we're also at this point in the women's peace movement when we're saying to ourselves, we're going to sit looking for a table to sit to be able to contribute to peace building, and what can we do? But I think the fundamental problem is the same problem that women have in terms of decision making, that women are so embattled with so many roles and responsibilities that their participation in the decision making is limited because of some of the roles they perform. And some of these roles are biological, others are social roles. And there are very few women who have been able to get themselves out of these roles and be able to multitask to the extent of being very active in decision making, but also in peace building. What would it take? What it will take is for us to change the approach. First, you have to ensure that women have the resources to be able to address those issues that are pertinent to them as mothers. When you talk about young women, of course, women are not homogeneous. In these categories, we have women, young women, women with children, older women, women who are working, those who are not working, but who, in one way or the other, contribute to the aspect of peace building and decision making, either at the family level or at the community level. So what it will take is for us to first recognize that we need to support these women to address some of those roles that they're playing, within the community, within the household, for them then to be able to push themselves forward to be at decision-making table, but also to train more women, grassroots women, and provide them with skills in peace building. We recently were talking about the women's standby force in Africa. If we are going to be able to have the resources to mobilize African women to storm African countries when there's an issue of violence and support the women in that country, to demand. There are lots of women who have been trained by the African Union, by the Commonwealth on peace building and mediation. But in many cases, a lot of these women have not been given that opportunity. But I think we need to train more of those women, particularly at the grassroots level, and build that momentum so that it trickles up instead of trickling down. So it takes resources to address the multiple layers of responsibilities of women. It takes donors to understand that a lot of these women might not be within organizations. They are informal women, ordinary women who are living daily, but who can be co-opted into the women's peace movement. It takes a lot, to do that, but it's something that we also are looking forward to being able to do in the African continent, that we women in Africa have the capacity and have what it takes, but we don't have the time, resources, we don't have the financial resources to be able to pull ourselves together. And so we need that support to be able to do this. I'm not saying that we cannot also fundraise by ourselves, but the capacity is really limited. Women are not economically empowered. Women are not so much educated, but we are educated and we can do this. So we need to do more in terms of education, economic empowerment. So it's kind of something that requires a holistic approach to pulling all of this together. It's not just like focusing on women and peace building, but women in leadership, women in economy, and women and education. So focusing on the rights of the girl child to be educated. I'm also not saying that only educated women can be in peace building, but they need that awareness in terms of what it takes to be in mediation, to be in peace building. That's the kind of education I'm talking about, apart from the formal education. Thank you, Monde.
Thank you so much, Helen. I was just thinking about your earlier presentation. I also think it's also behooves those of you on the ground, people such as your organization, it behooves you to figure out ways of sharing and amplifying the good lessons learned that you just shared with us today. This women's situation room. How do we get this out and perhaps embed it into the African peace and security architecture so that it becomes part and parcel of long-lasting infrastructure and the way we do business. So I think those are some of the ways that we can really speak to the, help drive or get to the point that our last questioner had for us. So thank you so much for that. So the next question is for you, John. It comes from Gustavo in South Africa, from one of our SVNP members. And his question to you is that while we often talk about issues related to the control of technology by governments, do you have any thoughts on how the continent can be less vulnerable to cyber attacks, including with the recent Pegasus soft spyware case? It is certainly about having African voices around the table, but also a space that is conducive to ensure the continent's already fragile ICT infrastructure does not leave Africa behind the global discussions. So I think that's one part. And I'm really going to layer on, John, because I had an add-on to that, you know, you talked about the three ways that governments with who are not very democratic, the three tools that they are using to undermine democracy, the internet shutdowns, the digital surveillance, and the disinformation. And so my question sort of builds on what I was just talking about with Helen. How can the African regional organizations and civil society, and even international partners, really push to address this in a more systemic way, to address this from a strategic viewpoint, to develop the frameworks that we need to catch up with what's happening in the real world, to develop the tools that we need to catch up with what's happening in the real world at that continental level, the regional level, and the international level, and who would the key players be in that for you? So over to you, John.
Well, great. Thanks, Monday. There's a lot there. On the question from Gustavo, I have to admit I've been staring at this question in the chat box and hoping it wouldn't come to me because I'm not sure I don't have a sufficient answer. And, you know, when we talk about this democracy and technology nexus, I come at it more from the democracy than the technology side of the equation. But I will say the point that I made about user education and digital literacy, I think, are awfully important. I mean, Africa might have weak ICT infrastructure, but every corner of the world is affected by these sorts of spyware and other attacks right now. And so there's only so many defenses technologically that you can put up. You know, I think the greatest defense is in how we engage with these things and how we learn about what to do and what not to do online. And that's clearly a learning process for a lot of us around the world every day. You know, Monday, to your question about the tools, there's a lot there. You know, one thing that comes to mind initially is, I mean, a few things. One is engagement with the technology companies, and particularly the social media companies, as it comes to disinformation. And so take the example of Ethiopia, for example. You know, as the recent elections approached in Ethiopia, you know, everybody was aware of the potential volatility of those elections. There were lots of conversations between civil society and Facebook in particular, in terms of their being ready for what was to come, and they're making investments in having monitors on their team that spoke the many relevant languages in Ethiopia. And I think to their credit, they made some of those investments, probably not all of them. But they clearly had an amplified effort to take hate speech and misinformation off the platform. A lot of that, I think, was because of pressure they felt from outside organizations in Africa and elsewhere to be more astute as to what was happening on their platform. So that's one. As it relates to the internet shutdowns, you know, it's interesting to think about the internet service provider companies that are actually the ones who, for the most part, you know, hold the controls to whether the internet is on or off and how fast it's going. You know, they're in a tough place because in most countries they are regulated by national governments, and national governments have a lot of influence over them. But still, I think there's more of a conversation to be had about whether those ISPs are able to push back against demands from national governments to shut down or slow down the internet, and whether they can get some sort of broader international backing for that kind of resistance. Because right now, I think they feel pretty much on their own and like they have no choice when those demands come from on high to shut things off. Those are two tools, and there are many more out there, but I don't want to take up too much time. And I know others on the panel probably have some ideas as well. Monday, you're on mute.
going to say thank you so much for that. You raise a lot of issues that I really think we ought to be thinking about as we move forward. So hopefully, you know, we're taking these down and we figure out how we go forward from there, both at the civil society, the national level, international partners as well, all have a role to play, and the technology companies themselves. I mean, I'm watching that debate play out in the US in terms of the role of technology partners in all of this. And I don't think we've quite settled what the way forward should be. And so it'll be interesting to see how that discussion plays out on the African continent, but it is an important conversation to be having. Let me turn to Max. We got a question here. Let me just read that out to you. Oops. Hang on a second. I just lost my, there we go. So the question that came for you, Max, is how important is rehabilitation for youth who were former combatants, and how can such processes better encourage youth participation in civil society, democracy, and peace building to contribute to long-term stability? And I think, you know, given Uganda's own background, I think that's a good question to pose to you, Max.
Just to understand the question, rehabilitation of which youth again?
Sorry, youth who were former combatants. So like the LRA and other such groups.
Okay, so thank you for that interesting question. So it's actually important because in peace building processes, people who have undergone through, you know, some of these devastating moments, or have been at the back end of the gun, or has been kidnapped in a way, have a better understanding of what it means to be peaceful. And of course, it also means that it has had an effect on them, on the family side, on the social network side, like friends and everything, and of course, that ability to be away, you know, from your loved ones. So rehabilitating them, it's something very important. One, it's because it builds long-lasting peace, and then secondly, they'll be able to be champions of, you know, peace building, and even when they are involved in politics per se, or elected in positions of power, or where they are able to influence policy, they are able to actually act consciously and not be able to inflict the same pain, you know, on their fellows, because they know what it means. And of course, be able to finally use the space to create policies that are able to be sustainable, bring sustainable peace, not only for the youth, but also for the entire country. And if it spills across the continent, for the entire continent. So such initiatives are actually on a rise, but it's something that, you know, can be picked up on and can be acted upon with the governments, alongside with international partners, to be able to integrate these people in society, so that we don't end up having them being, you know, branded like as a rebel group, but as people who have, you know, transformed, who have got back to the society, and to be able to build their capacity, not only rehabilitating them, you know, mentally, but there's also need to build their capacity in terms of, you know, technology use, in terms of how can they actually get involved in democratic processes, because they get offset off the track by being involved on the other side. So bringing them back to the society and integrating them to the society, including, you know, mentoring them, having them, you know, have a mentor to be able to take them through how to get involved in political and democratic processes, is something, you know, that can actually take us a long way, because I can say that if you maybe try to sideline them, they can actually develop another rebel group and be able to be like, you know what, since I am not accepted, you know, in the society, they can be able to actually inflict pain more, you know, further, and be like, after all, I was also, in a way involved in this, so I can actually carry it forward. So it's important for us to integrate this kind of rehabilitation, not only in the civil society space, but also government to take interest in in this, because it poses a threat to national, continental, and global security.
All right, thank you, Max. Let me turn to Helen very quickly. Helen, you talked earlier about how the numbers in terms of women's participation are going down and are further being challenged by the COVID situation. So, we're seeing that effective participation actually on a downward slope. At the same time, though, we do know that the AU probably has the African Union probably has one of the strongest gender frameworks. We know that a number of countries have adopted UN Resolution 1325. So what is it that is preventing the domestication of these frameworks at the local level? And what can we do? What can a civil society on the continent, what can international partners do to make sure that we can translate and domesticate and actually implement those frameworks that we have signed up to?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mond. And I think your question is valid because we keep talking about this, but just to say that most of the countries in Africa actually have domesticated all of those frameworks. If you look at the Maputo Protocol, for example, all countries have it, but actually they will sign it with reservations, but they don't have reservations on women's participation. They don't have the accepted. However, when you look at the institutions through which some of these laws should be able to be applied, it is not existing. I will give you an example, since we are talking about democracy and elections. Political parties do not have gender policies, and they do not provide affirmative action for women within political parties. You can hardly, there's no political party in Nigeria, in Uganda that is headed by a woman. All political parties are headed by men, and all the main leadership positions are held by men within political parties. But what can we do? Political parties have to be forced to adopt gender policies that also adopts the national policies. For example, we have affirmative action policies in some of these countries. Why wouldn't political parties ensure that they appoint 30% women to represent their parties during elections, for example? You actually find instances where political parties further disenfranchise women's participation within the political parties, and you find a lot of them go away and participate as independents. In Uganda, many of them won the elections, actually. So the African Union, having put down those laws, needs to follow up, track the implementation of these laws. We do have within the continent the Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security that has developed a framework for tracking the implementation of national action plans on 1325 in all the African continent. She's been pushing for all countries to have the national action plan. But you see, she has this framework that allows people to report what they've done. The framework does not have sanctions for countries who are not implementing the gender provisions that will enable women's participation. So I think the African Union has to do more in terms of developing and agreeing on sanctions for countries who do not apply, the domesticated laws to a greater extent that will see more women participate in decision making. But I think everybody has a role to play within the education sector, within the private sector, in terms of everyone adopting these measures to enable women get into decision making. We cannot just tie decision making to political decision making, because there are other sectors where women can actually play roles that all contribute to a more sustainable, peaceful, and sustainable development initiatives within countries. So I think that in terms of domestication, all actors, including the security sector, education, health sector, need to mainstream and ensure that women are participating at the level of decision making, but also at the local levels. You know, we have now domesticating the national action, localizing the national action plan for the implementation of 1325. But what do we see when we go to local communities? They're talking about sexual and gender-based violence. Yes, it is very important because we also want human security for women, but they usually will not pay attention to that. So we also need to raise that awareness in terms of, you know, ensuring that at all levels of governance, we adopt and domesticate these policies, but also empower the national machineries for women, the gender ministries, provide them with enough funding for them to be able to enforce implementation of these laws. Many of them do not have resources. They only have monies to pay salaries. They don't have monies to implement the strategies that they have to ensure that women participate in decision making. So I think that the international community needs to pay attention to the fact that a lot of the mechanisms that promote women's participation are not adequately funded by government because it's not a priority. But also, how do we then support local governance structures and other institutions to ensure that women are taken on board? I mean, scholarships for women at the university. We have very few universities who are doing that presently. Actually, some people are even calling to scrap the opportunities and affirmative action for women, thinking that we've already reached, but we've really not reached anywhere. So there are many things that we can do, but it has to be something that is more holistic in approach, but also providing that enabling environment for women to participate in politics, reduce the levels of violence, intimidation, but also we need to deal with the issues of corruption within political parties themselves and how they treat women by challenging them to put in place laws and policies within the political parties to ensure that women have fair representation and conducive environment to be part of the process.
So much. Let me conclude. Unmute. Thank you so much for that, Helen. Let me conclude with one question to John, and this is a question that also came up in the last discussion group. So looking from this side and looking into Africa on the technology issue, and as you obviously, as an international partner, the U.S. needs to be thinking about how democracy is evolving on the African continent and the value added that it can bring to shoring up democracy on the African continent, even as we deal with our own issues over here. As you look at the U.S. toolbox for engaging on democracy and peace building, what do you think would be the best tool that they can add to address this technology piece of how technology is impacting democracy and even peace building on the African continent? Is there a tool? Is there something we should be thinking about? Or is it an array of tools that we could be thinking about? And I think I would pose the same question to the African Union. You know, they have the African Union governance architecture. You have the African Union peace and security architecture. The real question I'm asking is, to what extent do these architectures and toolboxes speak to that technology dimension in terms of having a response, having a tool to address the more nefarious aspect of how technology is sometimes used and abused? So John, over to you.
Thanks, Monday. Really good questions. Let me try to address them. Broadly speaking, in terms of the AU, like in other topics, and Helen referenced this as well, there's some good words on paper, but the translation from paper to action is often lacking. And that's true in so much of what the AU does, unfortunately. I mean, there's some relatively progressive language there in terms of technology and other topics, but it's about the enforcement, it's about the promulgation across 49 countries. And that's where things too often fall apart. In terms of the US toolbox, there's a lot of tools. The one that I would come back to first and foremost is investing in our civil society partners across the continent who have a lot of innovative ideas around this basket of issues, who are in the position to be doing some of the more grassroots technology education that I've talked about, who are in the position to be filing some of the strategic litigation cases that I mentioned, and who are in positions to advocate with their own national governments in terms of regulation and policy around technology. We make some of those investments already, for sure, but there's a lot more of those investments to make. And a point that I often make to a lot of audiences is we have to trust our partners more in this and other fields, and we have to give them more unrestricted funds to let them be a lot more creative in what they do in this and other fields. I think this topic is going to be a big one for the administration here. I think technology is going to be a big part of the upcoming Democracy Summit that the administration is talking about. And I think African voices need to be really prominent in that conversation and to be talking about how these issues affect them on a daily basis. Because again, if you leave the conversation to the global north, you're going to get one kind of a conversation. It's going to talk about a lot of important issues, but technology is felt and used in similar ways and in different ways in other parts of the world. Finally, let's just keep in mind that there's a lot of incredible technology advances that are happening in Africa and parts of the continent that are well past the U.S. and others. You think about mobile money transactions, especially in Kenya, South Africa, elsewhere. You think about the technology hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, and elsewhere. There are innovations coming out of these places that can address some of the problems that we're talking about here, innovations that may well be ahead of Silicon Valley and other places, because people in those places, understand the problems in a more direct way and may have more direct solutions.
Thank you. This has been a fantastic discussion. My mind is racing in many ways, just the richness of all the ideas and issues that you've put on the table. Let me just try and conclude by hitting on some of the major points that I heard from our three main speakers, but also the interventions from our SVNP colleagues who gave their short interventions afterwards. The biggest issue, obviously, is one reinforcing the point made in the session earlier today, that democracy is facing challenges across the globe and including Africa. And that the pandemic obviously has exacerbated and sometimes even increased the pace of those challenges. It has either exposed challenges that we didn't know we had before. It has exacerbated some challenges, but it has increased the pace of this downward slope on the democracy trajectory. That's something we need to look out for. On the technology point specifically, I think the key point that John and several other people have made today is that technology is both a force for good and for bad when it comes to governance. And so it shouldn't be an either or, but we need to be alert to some of the more nefarious ways in which technology is being used to undermine our democracy. And John pointed to three such tools that autocrats are using to harness technology to further diminish democracy and to close the space for citizen participation and engagement in democracy. And those three things that he talked about were the use of internet shutdowns, digital surveillance, and disinformation. And so those are three areas. For those of you, you're all members of the SVNP, you work in civil society, my plea to you would be, how do you get ahead of the curve? How do you engage with these issues to prevent any more damage being done? How do you strategically, I think was the point that John raised, not all of us can get into the litigation phase, but there's strategic things that you can do in that civil society space to engage, slow down, diminish, stop the use of these tools in a way that further continues to harm democracy. There was a third area that I think some of you are already doing that John talked about in terms of some of the things that we can do, which is building up digital literacy across the continent. But we heard from all of you throughout earlier today and in this session about the gap that COVID has exposed between those who are now able to congregate virtually and those who are unable to congregate virtually or even go to school virtually. So even as we talk about this digital education, it's also about making sure that that gap does not increase, because we're further disenfranchising a whole population, the rural population. Max raised the issue about people who are in refugee camps, and because of the instability that so many countries have experienced, the fragility that so many countries on the African continent have experienced. We have whole generations who are spending their lives in these refugee camps. Let's not forget about them. They are citizens as well, maybe not officially tied to a country in the sense that many of us are, but let's not forget them as well. And I'm so glad that Max raised that issue. So it's understanding how COVID has impacted different constituencies, unpacking and disaggregating women, youth, and African citizens, and how COVID has impacted their ability to participate in democracy, and how technology can either help us engage more people, prevent them being further marginalized, and address some of the issues that John raised. So I think that that's really, really important. Another point that John raised was the importance of making sure that African voices are part of this conversation. Africa does not want to be sitting on the margins while rules and regulations are made about how we go forward in terms of regulating this space. It is a space that we have seen can do good, but can also do bad. African countries have to be part and parcel of that conversation. And so it's figuring out, for those of you in that civil society space, at the national space and the regional and sub-regional levels, how does Africa become a part of that space, and what are the issues that are unique to Africa that Africa wants to bring to the table so they can be considered as frameworks and strategies and regulations are adopted. On the gender front, I will start with where Helen left off. Which she really gave a good overview about all the good work that the AU has done on this question, but which we need to bring to life even more, and really attending to those challenges, that those challenges still remain, and women's ability to participate as is their right in democracy and to contribute as is their right to democracy has been further compromised by COVID. And so how do we engage on those issues? And I thought some of the innovations that Helen talked about, and I know there are many more. I know WANEP has been dealing with these issues across many, many countries in West Africa. I'm sure CDD in Ghana is doing similar things. So can we bring all of those lessons learned together, the innovations together, to really make sure that COVID does not set us back, but we're actually able to catch up and maybe even get ahead of COVID as we try and get more women to participate in the democratic space, as we try and get more women to contribute to peace building, as is their right. And we know they bring so much to those issues. So I think those are some of the things that I got from Helen. And on the youth front, I thought Max did a great job in terms of talking through, first of all, encouraging us to always remember that youth are not one homogeneous block, and therefore whatever solutions and entry points for engagement we come up have to suit the demographic within that larger group that you're talking about, whether it's on the democracy front, whether it's on the peace building front, that you really have to understand your audience, unpack it, and develop your solutions to fit that audience. But he also raised the ways in which COVID has impacted youth, I think using Uganda as an example. The transport fares that doubled, knowing fully well that unemployment hits this demographic, particularly unemployment and underemployment hits this demographic particularly hard. He talked about the mental health component, which many of us do not often talk about. Of COVID and the impact that it has had, the impact that it is having on young people, to make sure that we are looking at that. He talked about the digital literacy, limited digital literacy and skills, and how do we make this space more democratic and bring more youth into it, because it truly, truly is the future. And he had some really, really good examples. And then there was a larger discussion about COVID and development in general. We heard on the food security front, we heard on the technology front from some of the others. So I think there's a lot here. And what I would say to the SVNP is you bring tremendous heft in terms of thinking, strategic thinking, in terms of actually having an impact on the ground on these issues. So I'm hoping you are taking away from some of these issues from the discussion today, the issues that you can fold into the work or perhaps amplify or direct more strategically to address some of the issues that have come up here. And then to our audience of the American and other international partners, I hope what you have heard today are some of the issues that are on the minds of Africans in terms of the issues that they are addressing, the issues that they want to prioritize, the issues that give them most concern, but more importantly, the innovations that they have brought to the table on those issues. And perhaps you can engage with those innovations and amplify their work so that it has greater impact. And lastly, I just want to thank my colleague here, John, for really giving us a sense of, where Africa is on this technology front, but also how it compares to how democracy is playing out in other regions and in Africa, and speaking, I think, very directly to the issues that we're going to have to address in that African context. And with that, please join me in thanking our three main speakers and our three interveners, discussants, for a great, great session today. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next session. Let me see if I can find that. Our next session tomorrow will be a presentation on the state of peace building in Africa, lessons learned for policymakers and practitioners. This is a book that was recently published by the SVNP, and you're going to hear from 4 of our SVNP authors talking about the lessons learned from 30 years of peace building in Africa, what's working, what's not working well, and where do we go from there. So I hope you can join us for that tomorrow. Thank you very much, the Wilson Center team, for putting this on. Bye, and see you tomorrow.